So thank you everyone for joining us for today's event on science policy and diplomacy, whether you're in Zoom or in person. We're so happy to have you here, and we're thrilled to have our panelists with us who are going to talk about their roles in science diplomacy and science policy more generally. So I'll give a brief introduction to our first speaker, Dr. Nancy Sung. So Dr. Nancy Sung is a UNC alum. She is the deputy head acting of the Office of International Science and Engineering at the NSF on detail from her position as Science Policy Advisor in NSF's Office of Polar Programs. She's also served as a Science Attaché, did I get that right? The pronunciation? Yep. At the US Embassy in Beijing, and has also held many other roles with the NSF. We're so excited to hear about your experience with science diplomacy, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Rami. And it's really nice to be with the UNC crowd. And back when I was in grad school at UNC, I was living in Odom Village. Does that even still exist? Married student housing. I was working in the lab at Lineberger. I wouldn't have ever guessed that my career would have played out the way it has. And at the time, there was nothing like this policy group. So it's really fun to see what you've done. So on the first question, I think I was asked to talk about what role does science policy play in international relations? And I want to flip it a little bit and just talk about what is diplomacy, or how I understand it. And my colleagues can argue with me if they want. But I think of diplomacy as building and strengthening the ties between nations by first making the effort to understand each other, and then to find common cause, to pursue the things that are in the interest of our country. But we need to have something in common with these other nations in order to work together. So it works at several levels. One is the very high level, like when we see presidents or the Secretary of State or ambassadors interacting with their counterparts in other countries. But then another level could be what you call public diplomacy. So that would be increasing the awareness of the other country in the hearts and minds of the public. So building people-to-people ties. So the more of these small-scale ties there are, the greater is the political pressure to keep things together at the higher level. And then the more resilient the relationship is when there's conflict. So if you think of it like a really thick rope that has many, many fibers in it, it's really hard to break. And those many fibers are the relationships between citizens in our countries. So if our people, Americans, think of people in another country as humans who share their same hopes because we know them, it's very different from when those sorts of ties don't exist. And it's a lot easier to dehumanize and demonize citizens of another country. So that's just sort of a little thing on what is diplomacy. It's complex, but science diplomacy, I would say, is when the common cause is science, working on questions that are of interest to both countries. So it not only means we get to share the work of something that matters to both of us, but it also means we're creating some of those small scale ties between people. So between PIs and maybe even more importantly, between students, because they will carry those relationships with them through their careers for decades. So how does this work in difficult relationships? So let me give you an example. And you all know about how Nixon opened up the US relationship with China in the 70s. And one of the first things we did was sign a science and technology agreement, or an STA, with China. This was in 1979. And on the US side, it was signed by President Jimmy Carter. On the Chinese side, by Deng Xiaoping. And at the time, China was just emerging from the Cultural Revolution, had fallen far, far behind other countries. And if any of you have been to China lately, you would not believe how different it was then. Just the level of poverty, the lack of technology. And at that point, the US had already put people on the moon. So there was a real imbalance. And China was very much still communist at the time. But I think the thinking on the US side was that if we began cooperating in science, it would be genuinely useful to China. And the hope was that it would lead to greater openness and stronger ties of friendship between our nations. And so if we play that out over decades, so until say 10 years ago, we get to the point where the US and China have become each other's most significant collaborator. So if we measured by joint authorship on publications, we published together more than either nation did with any other country. And hundreds of thousands of students from China came to study in the US. And many of them stayed here, but in the later years, many went back to China, taking innovative ways of thinking with them. And there's something very special about the way the US fosters creativity and freedom of thought in people. And that's why our science is so amazing. And China encouraged this, initially starting with Deng Xiaoping, who was very visionary and pragmatic. American innovation was sought after and admired. So that all seems really positive. And the US belief was that science, which is about freedom of thought and openness, bringing things to light, that it would contribute to greater openness in China, making it maybe more democratic and also building China's economy. So their scientific enterprise grew, became more sophisticated. Their investments in S&T grew to rival our own. And so it looked like we might be poised to work together as peers to solve big problems together, like climate change, infectious disease, for example. And the last 10 years have been a very different story from that very hopeful, bright, happy kind of thing. But rather than going into that, I'll just tell you about some of my experience in the middle of it, and then I can tell you more about that if I have time. But so for 4 years, I was a science attaché at the US Embassy and the head of the NSF, the National Science Foundation office, which was in the US Embassy. So what that means is that I reported to the ambassador, and my job was to build collaborations with Chinese science agencies. And I think I have another couple minutes, right? So I'll tell you about one of them. So my background is in virology. That's what I studied at UNC in Lineberger. And when I first got to NSF in 2011, I discovered that we had a program called the Ecology and Evolution of Infectious Disease. So it was about how does infectious disease move from between species, across space, all of this sort of thing, and how does it change? And I thought we need to be working with China on this. And so I reached out to my colleagues in the Biological Sciences Directorate, and they agreed. They said, yes, we would love to have China as a partner in this program. And so when I got to Beijing in 2014, this was something we worked on very hard. We had lots of meetings with our counterpart in China, and they were a little sensitive because of SARS that had taken place in 10 years previous. So they wanted to really move carefully in this, but over time we had a series of meetings, and then everyone agreed, yeah, we can do this, we can collaborate. And our thinking was, because the next pandemic is going to arise in China, because of the changes in land use, there are so many reasons why that was likely. We really need to start working together now so that when it happens, we have these bridges of trust and we can work together. Well, we all know what happened, right? This program, it takes years to put programs together with other countries. And we started working on this, it was actually in like 2012. And it took until 2018 to actually have a program where we had a joint solicitation for proposals with China. And so we were trying to lay the groundwork, but it was 2019 when the pandemic hit. And so we thought maybe if we had 5 years, that would be enough lead time. So we have a really solid basis to work together, but we had like 1 year, which wasn't enough time. And so it wasn't only the pandemic, but it was other changes happening on both sides of the Pacific that caused the relationship to begin slowly and then steadily unraveling to the point where we have it now. But I'll just say that's an example. In my case, it was a real privilege to be in China at that time, working really hard to try to create more of those ties that we really, my staff and I really believe that having this way to work together on something that meant something to both of us, that was really important and inspiring work that we were very privileged to do. So maybe I'll just give you that one example. Maybe one other thing I'll just throw in. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? Whoa, really? Okay. All right. Well, maybe I won't take 5 minutes just to leave more time for the other questions, but I'll just say one other thing I worked on a couple years ago. I don't know why I end up in these situations where I'm working with the hardest country, right? I was in our Office of Polar Programs, and you may or may not realize that half the Arctic is in Russia, and the Arctic is melting and thawing. And if we want to understand climate change, and in particular, what's happening as the permafrost thaws, we really have to work with Russia. And so our office was doing everything we could to reach out to Russia and to try to build scientific ties and to amp up our cooperation, in particular on permafrost. And then February 2022 happened, and we had to completely stop all of that effort. So often our science diplomacy efforts are overcome by events, as we say, and we can't maybe fulfill the hopes that we had to work together. But I think what I can say is that I think those of us in federal agencies are just waiting for the day when we can work with Russia again. And I think when that day comes, we're going to be ready to reach out and work with them again. At the moment, it's not possible. So I think that I hope that just gives you maybe a high level overview of one view of what diplomacy and science diplomacy is, and a couple examples of what it looks like in some difficult situations. But maybe I'll yield the next 2 minutes to my colleagues here and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Seems we have, oh wait, here we go. Adam, I think, got booted off.
Uh-oh.
Hopefully he's back. Adam, are you back with us?
I hope so. Yes. There.
Awesome. Great.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry for the brief interruption there.
No worries. I'm glad to have you back. I'll introduce you next if that's okay. So Dr. Adam Shapiro is a former AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, and he currently manages the U.S. Embassy Science Fellows Program, which I'm sure he will tell us about today. He is also the author of many different books and the editor of others as well, and a prolific writer for many publications, including The Atlantic, American Scientist, Religion and Politics, and others. So Adam, thank you for being with us today. We're so excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you everyone who's watching. Thank you to Nancy and to Aaron as well. Actually, just to further a little bit more of that introduction, when I joined the Department of State as a AAAS fellow, my initial position was in the Bureau for Educational and Cultural Affairs, which is the part of the State Department that does cultural exchanges, that does, as Nancy was alluding to, public diplomacy. And so personally, I think a lot about diplomacy as public diplomacy, almost by default, which is actually fairly unusual, I think, for many people in the State Department who tend to think more of diplomacy as being state-to-state level of interactions, interactions amongst leaders, interactions amongst governments, the kinds of things that are codified in treaties and agreements and various kinds of official documents. But a lot of diplomacy, as Nancy alluded to, is also at this sort of level of people-to-people connection. And honestly, if you never get to the point where the work that is happening at a national level gets down to the point where people are interacting with each other, then your diplomacy isn't doing the actual work. At least that's my opinion. I can't say that that's the opinion of the entire State Department. I won't say that. But in many ways, that was sort of the mindset that I brought into my opportunity now in our Bureau for Oceans, Environment, and Science, running what I consider to be one of the best science diplomacy programs in the US government right now, which is the Embassy Science Fellows Program. The program's been running for a little bit over 20 years. And the basic idea was that was rooted in a recognition that there's a tremendous amount of fantastic scientific expertise all across the US government, sometimes in places where you wouldn't necessarily think to look for it. Sometimes in very obvious places like the National Science Foundation or NOAA or the US Geological Survey or many of our other federal agencies, but also sometimes in places that you might not automatically associate with science, such as the Department of Veterans Affairs or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or various other parts of the US government. And there is a need for a lot of scientific expertise that our embassy partners are seeing all over the place. So the US manages embassies in almost every country of the world. And they are our eyes and ears on the ground, and they report back to us what's going on in various countries, That's how we get advanced warning of political circumstances, but also of circumstances that might require science and technical expertise. This is how we get advanced warning of what a country is doing to mitigate the effects of climate change, or how they are struggling with combating wildlife trafficking, or how they are reacting to public health crises that are emerging in their country or in nearby areas. The Embassy Science Fellows Program is basically an attempt to connect the expertise we have with the needs for that expertise that we see overseas. And so the way that that works is that our embassies will submit proposals requesting short-term loans of scientists from the US government, and we send them on short-term assignments overseas. And so these typically last less than 3 months. They've become a bit more flexible in the past few years as we've basically created virtual and hybrid capacities, initially as a result of COVID-19, but certainly a modality we're continuing with just as we're doing right now. And so the program has grown from an initial pilot collaboration with the NSF over 20 years ago, which I think in its first year sent about 7 scientists abroad, to a program that has sent over 70 a year in the most recent year. We're expecting a similar number in this coming year. So the program has not only diversified in terms of the number of science agencies that participate in the program, and diversified in terms of the range of expertise from scientists that we send abroad. It's also diversified in terms of the kinds of things that these scientists are doing. Initially, this program was conceived as, here is a short-term fix to an acute and emerging need for this particular kind of expertise. And increasingly, we realized that when American scientists are going abroad, they reflect not just the kind of expertise that they possess, but they reflect their entire human person as a scientist and as a representative of the US government. In other words, these kinds of goals that are the public diplomacy goals that Nancy was talking about earlier. And so we want to embrace that and embrace the fact that we are not just sending scientific expertise abroad, we are sending people abroad who possess that expertise, and to make use of that human factor to emphasize human connections. And so increasingly we've seen fellows doing outreach events to talk to people, to encourage. We've seen programs where Embassy Science Fellows have talked to women and girls in STEM in countries where career pathways for women have traditionally in the science fields have traditionally been very sharply curtailed, talking about ways in which science careers are even possible, and how it's science and promoting STEM education as an opportunity. We've seen programs where people are raising public awareness about public health, and you can't do public health without public. Let's just leave it at that and just say that in order to do the kind of global health work that we do, we don't just need medicines, we don't just need doctors who are able to administer those things, we need a public that is aware of the problems that are faced. So increasingly we've seen sort of public diplomacy aspects grown into the Embassy Science Fellows program. I think we've also seen some really creative uses of the program basically as a project incubator. Given that people are coming for short-term projects, that does not mean that they can't have long-term consequences. So what we see is that various agencies send scientists overseas to partner with local government counterparts, or with NGOs, or with private sector to tease out the possibility of future partnerships, of future collaborations, to prove that we can work together so that we can then justify seeking whatever we need to grow those partnerships. And we have seen things grow out of this program that I'm impressed. We've seen in just the past year a continent-wide One Health global environmental health network that was seeded by Embassy Science Fellows from several agencies kind of working in concert together, and that this has become a sustained project. We've seen the development of international climate hubs and data sharing. Basically, what we've seen is that in a world in which many of the global challenges that we face have some science or technology component to them, whether that's in the health arena, if in the climate arena, in solving energy issues, or in even in things like exploring space, or exploring the depths of our ocean, or cleaning up marine pollution. Almost all of the big problems that we face are problems in which science and technical expertise can help solve these things. And this is what that program is designed to do. Even though it is a small program, it is a program that has, I think, increased that kind of flexibility. And so that's been a really, really heartening thing to see. To be honest, nothing has given me more confidence in the ability of our government to solve problems than the fact that, essentially, as part of my day job, and I know this is a question that you had sort of asked us to say, what does a typical day look like? We might get a request from an embassy asking for expertise in cleaning up oil spills, or in detecting antiquities forgeries to prevent trafficking in cultural properties, or to assist in space weather, or to assist in vaccine production. And we find these experts. They have these experts all across the government, and that makes me feel like, yeah, maybe we can do things, and maybe it gives me a reason for hope and optimism. So I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll have plenty of time for more discussion.
Thank you so much. I'll introduce Dr. Aaron Salzberg next, who's here with us at UNC. He is the current director of the Water Institute at the University of North Carolina, and he also served as the special coordinator for water at the U.S. Department of State from 2010 to 2017. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We are excited to learn more about your role in science diplomacy.
No, Rami, thanks for inviting me, and it's great to be here, of course. And thanks to Nancy and Adam for taking the time to join us here at UNC. Really appreciate your guys, giving us some of your time. It's great to see you guys here. First, just to build off something Adam just said, I think it's really underappreciated how much the rest of the world respects U.S. science and U.S. capabilities. And just how, he mentioned this idea of requests that come to the Department of State and to other agencies for support for things that we do. I cannot tell you the times. And in fact, if you travel internationally, one of the things that I found when I was working closely with the Water and Power Authority in Pakistan is I asked the director, the minister of that ministry, how many people in his ministry had been educated in the United States. And he went back and he asked, and he came back to me and he said over 96% of his staff had at one point been educated in the United States in some way, shape, or form. And so this idea of U.S. science and technological expertise and the way it's respected across the globe, our education system and the way it's respected across the globe has been incredibly influential everywhere. And in fact, I'm always astounded when I go and travel internationally, when I meet with ministers, how many of them were educated in the United States and got their training here. And to me, I think that's one of the most, it's one of the things we don't do anymore the way we used to, and it's one of my pet peeves about USAID and some of the things that we do within the U.S. government is we don't support education programs the way we used to, and we don't support universities in bringing over international students the way we used to. And this is something I think we definitely need to reconsider as we build both our own scientific capacity, but strengthen the relationships between the United States and other places and how we do science. And hopefully Nancy and Adam have thoughts on that too. I know you asked me to reflect a little bit on the role that scientists play in mitigating policy decisions between actors with different values. And I might reframe that a little bit, only because I'm not sure scientists necessarily play a role in mitigating policy decisions. It does happen on occasion, but really not as a general rule. I think Nancy alluded to this, right? There's this whole idea of a field of science diplomacy. And most scientists really, just on their own general nature, are not really equipped for that role. And we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like and what that involves. But being a diplomat and being a science diplomat is combining a set of different skill sets. And I'd love, and one of the things that I think we try to stress in the students that we're working with here at UNC is we want all of our scientists to be literate, to be able to communicate their science to the general public and to policymakers in ways that they can understand and in ways that can influence policymaking, but also be sensitive to the challenges of science, right? Because we know this, and as policymakers, they view scientific information extraordinarily skeptically. Right. And we know this as scientists, we know there's lots of bias that's built into the research that we do. We know that a lot of the peer-reviewed research is still flawed and has a lot of challenges with it. We know that we live in a world where there's a lot of mis and disinformation, and that can often dominate the discourse. And we also know that people's perceptions of risks and challenges is much, much different, and it's really vested in your own lived experience. And these are all things that we want to build that kind of literacy within our scientists as they come out of school and begin to engage, so that they can be better science diplomats. But to be frank, it doesn't come natural to a lot of scientists. And so, it's a really interesting space. For me, it's a great and exciting space to work in. And I hope it's one that, every scientist will want to build those skill sets to get there. At the end of the day, and both Nancy and Adam mentioned this, we're dealing with relationships. We're dealing with people's feelings and perceptions. And for me, and this is what, at the root of what science diplomacy really is, it's really about protecting and advancing U.S. national interests at the end of the day. But for me, it's the science and data collection process that can be a great way to build relationships among stakeholders. And it's something that we often overlook. But this process where you can, where you can jointly collect, analyze, work with data is a great way to provide a space where you can build communication skills between different parties, where you can allow parties to express different feelings about how they interpret science, about how they see the science, about the social, cultural, and other values that are attached to the science data that's being produced. And that's really important when you're talking about solving political types of problems. And so, for me, that scientific process is one of the most amazing tools that we have to advance our diplomatic interests. And that includes everything from peace and security to development assistance, and to all, as Nancy was mentioning, some of the health challenges that we face and all the other types of things that we're doing. I'll give you an example. I was working I was negotiating between three countries that were threatening to go to war over a particular water issue. Now, our technical teams, the Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Reclamations, they could go out and we could give them the answers. We could tell them exactly what the problem was and how they could solve it. And we could run those models and we could just give them all of that. But the reality is that in those types of settings, the countries would then spend years arguing over the validity of the data, arguing over what the data meant, arguing over how it was produced and everything else. So instead, we kind of flipped that model around. What we often did was we would actually engage the countries collectively to work together to collect the data, develop the model, jointly analyze the scenarios so that the countries would have a greater confidence in those outputs. And after a period of years of working together, these experts who often would spend nights together reviewing the data, talking about the data, talking about what it meant, these opportunities, whether it's in, Adam could talk about the IVLP programs where we invite scientists to the United States to go around, but these opportunities where we take people and we put them together to spend time looking at a shared challenge, it gives them a chance to explore different social, cultural, economic, political factors and issues that are often influencing how they make policy decisions. And that's really, really important. It also helps them develop the language of how they communicate with each other. And that, I think at the end of the day, for me, trying to get countries to agree to a particular treaty or a particular arrangement over how they're going to solve a problem, that's one thing. But that's not the real benchmark of success. For me, it's that the countries have developed a process for how they can work together, how they can talk to each other in order to solve joint challenges. Nancy mentioned this, right? And this idea that we have some major global challenges that we have to deal with, everything from climate change to pandemic preparedness to water. And we're going to need to communicate and work together to be able to solve those types of challenges. We're going to need to be able to talk across these different cultural biases and differences, and we're going to need to appreciate them in the solutions that we try to develop to work with them. And to me, that's what creates long-lasting solutions, was that we've institutionalized the way that we work together. Not that we decided that you get this and you get this, but that we've got a process, because we all know this, right? The world is changing very rapidly. Any water solution that we have today is not going to be the same solution we're going to have 10 years or 20 years or 50 years from now because of the impacts of climate change and all sorts of other things. So we need to be adaptable. All of our processes need to be adaptable. And so it's the way that we work together and integrate science and evidence into that process. Let's not use science and evidence to be determinative necessarily, but how we integrate good science and evidence into a process, how we build institutions that can do that thoughtfully, and support a dialogue and a conversation between folks to get to sound decisions that we can all stand by and implement. I think that's the real goal, and to me, the real value of what we can do with science.
Thank you so much, all of you, for your comments and sharing your experiences with us. We'll kick it off with some of the questions that were pre-submitted. And all of you have kind of touched on how you got involved in science policy and science diplomacy, but I'm wondering if you have anything you'd like to add to that, and if you could also answer what a typical day in your role might look like. Who wants to kick us off?
Well, if I could maybe just, one thing that Aaron had just said that I was thinking about that sort of touches on this question as well. I came into working in science policy after spending the first career of my life as a professional historian of science, a historian of science communication and science education. So working on, historic, NSF funded, thank you, research on the history of STEM education in the United States. And I think that for those of us who are familiar with kind of the way that science communication works, we often talk about something called the deficit model of STEM communication, of science communication, this idea that people will embrace science more if they just had more information about it. And it's sort of a deficit of information that is responsible for people acting foolishly when it comes to making science-based decisions. And all we need to do is give them that data. And we know that this is absolutely false. We have about a quarter century of good social science research about how people make decisions, about how they incorporate new data, to know that this fails. And to know that this, in some cases, actually creates backlash scenarios. I think that what Aaron was alluding to, and I think to what Nancy and I were also talking about when we were talking about public diplomacy, is the fact that diplomacy also sometimes has a deficit model problem, and that the relationship building, the being a trustworthy actor who you can then give that information to, has to precede the information itself. In other words, public diplomacy is not the same thing as public affairs. It's not just about having good talking points or having good sound bites. Those can be useful, those can be helpful as part of a larger suite. So, I expect that a lot of people who are interested in science policy have also thought about the challenges of science communication and engagement more generally. And so, to my mind, coming from where I came from into this field, I've always seen that parallel. Happy to let Nancy or Aaron reflect on that or answer whatever they want to say.
Maybe I'll chime in. I don't think I said how I got into it, but I can tell you that. And I kind of got into science diplomacy before science policy, and without really knowing what it was. So during my postdoc, so at Lineberger, I was in Joe Pagano's lab. I don't know if you guys remember him. He was the founding director. And then I moved to Nancy Raptraub's lab for my postdoc studying Epstein-Barr virus, which you may know is associated with a kind of cancer very common in China. There's a nasopharyngeal carcinoma, or NPC. And so I thought it would be really cool for my postdoc to go to China and try to understand more of the genetic epidemiology of NPC. So I applied for a fellowship from the WHO, and they funded it, I think, because I was probably the only person who was applying to go from the US to a developing country and not the other way around. So I think that's probably they were probably like, well, what is she thinking? Because at the time, actually, a lot of people, faculty at UNC, thought I was kind of throwing away my career to do that. It was 1994, so it was still really the scientific Stone Age in China. And I spent 2 years at the Institute of Virology in Beijing, not the more famous one in Wuhan. But I was the only foreigner in the whole institute, and it was a transformative experience. So I learned to survive and thrive in a very foreign environment. It was very difficult, but it gave me some great skills I never would have gained otherwise. So one of which is I learned how to speak Chinese. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then that sort of, there's a lot more chapters of it. But in terms of a typical day, there's not a typical day. When I look at my calendar, I'm looking over here at a list here. Monday, I met with the director of the AI Institute of Sweden. Last week, I was in a National Security Council meeting talking about how the war in Ukraine has impacted collaboration with Russia. A major effort our office is working on is to build scientific collaboration with the Quad. That's the US, India, Australia, and Japan. So, and then this afternoon, I'll go over to state and co-chair an international S&T meeting there. So, but then in addition to that, there's all the management of our office. So our communications, our knowledge management, our budget, and being part of NSF's senior leadership team. So I'll just say every day is bursting at the seams and no day is the same.
Yeah, I mean, I can just add, I mean, actually, it's interesting to hear Nancy's experience. So I had Epstein-Barr when I was younger, really bad, and it went into my nervous system, which it doesn't do to a lot of people, and it was quite debilitating. And so I became very interested in virology. And at the time, there were negotiations going on the Hill about our stopping funding for the CDC early warning centers for pathogens. And I was watching this debate play out, and I was listening to the scientists trying to explain to our policymakers why this was important. And I was saying to myself that there's no way the policymakers are going to get this. They're not explaining it in terms that those policymakers will understand. And I was really concerned about this idea of pandemic preparedness and this is back in the 90s, where we were really cutting a lot of funding for this. And so I was very deliberate about going back to school specifically to pick up the skills that I needed to engage policymakers directly on issues like this and to be able to explain these subjects to them. And so I was very deliberate about that process. And you're as a policymaker or a science policy person, look, you're often driven by the demands of what's going on around you. And if you're working inside the government, well, then it's the crisis of the day, which could be anything from what's going on in Russia, could be China policy, could be whatever, the phone call that you got from an embassy. So those things can be happening. But even here at UNC, over the last month, we were up at the UN launching a major initiative with the Secretary General on eradicating lead in drinking water globally. We've been working with ministers in several countries right now to launch efforts around clean drinking water. We're working on flood protection. I mean, there's all sorts of things where your diplomatic skills, so to speak, come into play in trying to achieve what I would call results at scale. And that's where I think diplomacy adds the most value. As scientists, you can work away in your lab, you can invent the greatest thing in the world. The question is that thing relevant to a major problem? And if it is, how can you actually get the rest of the world to solve that problem now based on what you did, right? If you're going to achieve change at scale, it's not what you do, it's how many other people you can convince to do what you want them to do. And so as a policymaker, my goal was great. I might have the greatest idea for doing, for cutting sliced bread, whatever it is. But my going out and doing that I can only do 100 slices a day. And that means by the end of the day, by the time I'm dead, I will only address 2,000 people. My goal was to reach millions of people. And so by working through, for example, the policy process where I led the development of the US's global water strategy, which is impacting millions and millions of people across the globe. We've been able to develop other programs and processes that are impacting millions and millions of people. If you're trying to achieve impact at scale, diplomacy gives you that leverage to move science and evidence into a space where you can scale up action in a way that almost nothing else can. Certainly no publication on its own would do.
Thank you all. So I'll pivot to our next question, which we talked about right before we officially started this webinar, and that's, can science policy ever truly be international? And to follow up, can you foresee any issues that could be governed on a global scale? Why or why not? Who'd like to take a crack at this one first?
Well, I guess I said in the preview to this that I had what I think is a cool answer to this. So this is a hard question, but there is one great example of it that you probably never think about, which is Antarctica. We have an Antarctic treaty. So no one owns Antarctica. So what the treaty does is it sets aside all territorial claims, and it sets aside the whole continent for peaceful scientific purposes. So that means no mining or extraction, no military presence. And imagine, this was 1959, during the Cold War. 12 nations, including Russia, signed this treaty, agreeing to these things. So now there are 56 nations that are parties to the treaty, and there are about 29 nations that are consultative parties, which means that they've demonstrated an active scientific research program. So they meet every year and they share about the scientific discoveries. And the US, our program in Antarctica is managed by the National Science Foundation, and we maintain 3 research stations. Sorry, the pollen is getting to me. At any rate, so this is a case where US policy, US science policy is actually submitted to this treaty. And the treaty values and agreements that we've all come to. And the treaty has been in effect, as I said, since 1959, but it is threatened now because there are countries that are blocking the consensus, and it's very difficult now to make progress just the last 5 years. For example, setting aside marine protected areas. The last time we succeeded with that was, I think, 2017. One of the largest marine protected areas in the world was agreed to. There are others that are proposed right now, but it's very hard to get them even voted on because several nations are blocking consensus. But that's in a place where we have a number of years, 60 some years of science policy being, national science policy being submitted to a global agreement. That may be the only one that's actually working and it's threatened, but I wanted to throw that out as one example that you may not know about.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. And I think Nancy also highlighted some of the emerging challenges, I think, to some of those things. I mean, right now, the lack of trust in multilateral institutions, the unilateralism, which, President Trump, and I think was a key champion of this, right? It's make our country's interests trump everybody else's country's interests. I think that growing dynamic is threatening a lot of those processes and making it very, very difficult for us to advance. Even in the United States, when was the last time we've actually Senate ratified a multilateral treaty or agreement? Yeah, exactly, Adam. It may have been 50, 60 years. And that's kind of a reflection of the real challenge of achieving that kind of consensus around some of these really, really complicated issues. When I was a state, actually, one of the first issues that I worked on was human cloning. And so this was back in the 2000 when we were trying to reach an international agreement banning human cloning. And there was discussions around, well, all the scientists are against this. And I said, well, they're against it now because we can't do it safely. But 10 to 1, if we can do it safely, guess what? Science is going to change their views on this. And it's going to be a little challenging. But we're seeing instances, right, where cloning is advancing in places where we don't have a say and we can't control what people are doing in different places. And I think this is going to be a real challenge going forward. When even this shift away from where I guess diplomacy used to be between countries, where a lot of our strategic interests were threatened by countries. Nowadays, a lot of our strategic interests can be threatened even by small groups and even by individuals. And so how do we reorient ourselves around a broad science policy that ensures the United States can be protected against the actions of small groups or small individuals or individual countries that might want to advance certain scientific enterprises that might be harmful at the end of the day. And that can be, I think that's going to be an extraordinary challenge, especially when it comes to the development of biological weapons, of mass destruction, the things where individual groups might be able to do great deal of harm, and that we as the scientific community are going to try to regulate that, but might not be successful in doing so.
Yeah, I think that last point, Aaron, is a really, I think, important one. Because I think when Rami, when you asked a question, one thought that I had was what's the difference between asking if science policy can be international versus can science policy be global? And I think that a lot of scientists still sort of persist in this kind of science is a pure enterprise mentality, which imagines that it is somehow compartmentalized away from politics and compartmentalized away from sort of the social consequences of the work that it does, and conveniently uses that as an excuse to say, therefore, national borders don't matter. Policy doesn't matter. What people do with the fruits of my scientific labor don't matter, because science is this pure and purely objective thing. Often that ends up becoming kind of a fig leaf for saying, therefore, we don't have to worry about issues about inequality within the scientific community, or the ways in which scientific practices do have ethical and political implications. And I think that increasingly people are realizing that this is kind of a false mythologized view of science as this abstract and pure thing. But it still, I think, persists in this kind of difference between global versus international, this idea of what role does relationships between different nation states have in dictating the conduct of science. And we are seeing many scientists resist policies that are put in place to protect national security or to protect the integrity of intellectual property claims, which we see as necessary to promote innovation, for example, and protect innovation. But there's also, I think, this broader question that Aaron was alluding to about, well, what about the fact that many of the major players in science, technology, innovation are not functioning in a nation state model, either because they are non-state actors with perverse interests like terrorist cells or other individual groups that we might be concerned with, or the fact that in many cases multinational corporations are capable of acting either outside of national guidance or have sufficient economic clout to circumvent that kind of guidance. And so how do we try to regulate companies that can literally move jurisdictions in order to avoid that kind of regulation? I think that what we're actually seeing perhaps is a shift from a need for international science policy to a shift to global science policy, where some of these non-state actors have to be considered, and whether multilaterals are going to be a way to do that, or whether nation states engaging with these principles directly in these kinds of asymmetrical ways is going to need to be a larger factor in what we do going forward.
Great. So you all mentioned different science policy issues, and I'm wondering if there's any science policy issue that stands out to you as having the greatest need to be addressed on a global scale.
If I can just say that, if I can just go by what are the embassies asking for embassy science fellows for, mitigating the effects of global climate change and global public health seem to be numerically the ones that we tend to get the most requests for. And that's probably because those are problems that are faced everywhere around the world. A lot of other problems are more locally specific.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I was thinking of those two as pandemic sort of issues and climate change issues.
All right, so I'd have a different take on this. One I would think, one is communication and one is scientific literacy. I am really concerned that we're not building a scientifically literate public who can actually engage in discussions around some of these critical issues. And I think, look, ultimately, and the world in science is getting really complicated, right? It's getting really complex and hard to understand what's going on at the cutting edge of science in many fields, and especially for a layperson. And I do think we have to do a better job communicating what these things mean. And we have to be much more careful about our communications. Again, now that we've got where everything can be faked, videos can be faked and people can be faked, where mis and disinformation, again, will dominate our discourse. How we speak as scientists and how we reflect scientific information, I think is really, really important for us to maintain the legitimacy and the primacy of science in these discussions. And I really worry that scientists undercut themselves. And, it's hard, right? I mean, a good example of the discussions over COVID, my wife works for Dr. Fauci very closely, and we would often hear somebody say something, well, this isn't going to happen. This is zero. Well, 1 in a million is not zero, right? 1 in a million in the United States means 300 people will be affected that way. And some of those 300 people will have access to the internet. And they will talk to their colleagues and their friends, and they will spread it around. And even though it might be a 1 in a million occurrence, it might get projected in a way that changes and shifts the risk perception and the understanding of our policy positions in what we do. And so I think, we as scientists have to be very clear about how we communicate uncertainty in particular. And this is very true around climate change. I really do think, 20, 30 years ago, I think climate scientists set us back many, many years because they were not clear about the uncertainty in what they were saying. And had they been more clear about the uncertainty, they wouldn't have, I think their credibility would have been much higher and much stronger in the public discourse that we had around climate change. And we may have been able to engage the public more quickly on some of these issues. The fact is, as a scientist, if you make one mistake, then you're not legitimate anymore. And that's a real problem in the policy space and sphere. And so I think we have to counter that with building communication skills among our scientists, building scientific literacy among our public, and look, engaging on these issues, talking to people, not being shy about this. The more we talk about these complicated science issues in every public forum that we can get, the better off we'll be.
Hi, I was just going to add to that. I think an issue is we really need greater public understanding of what we will lose if we don't work together as well. Because getting back to something I said in my opening remarks about how it's very easy to just dehumanize the citizens of other countries. And we're not helped by when our media does that and just makes it far easier for the public to just have one opinion about a country without understanding what do we gain by working? What are the ways, for example, with China, what are the ways it's really in the US interest to work together? It's very hard for the nuance of those things to cut through the very broad brush nationalistic messages that are being trumpeted very loudly on both sides. So that's I guess that's a public question. But just
if I could add to that, I would say it's not just increasing scientific literacy because science is hard to understand, but to recognize that there is also active scientific disinformation. And that's not new. I mean, we were asking the question of how we got into this field. I wrote my dissertation on the rise of the American anti-evolution movement 100 years ago, and that playbook is still being used. It was used by the tobacco cancer link denialists. It's been used still in the evolution space, but it's been used by climate change denialists. And more recently, it's been used by people spreading disinformations about COVID. And a lot of times what we see is a very similar creation and sort of deliberate packaging of doubts, which goes towards discrediting scientists and the claims that they make, but also discrediting the idea that science has a role to play in policy. And so this is not separated from the larger kind of political disinformation that we see about election interference. This is not separate from the kinds of disinformation that we see that has more obvious kind of financial, market manipulation or things like that. And so it's not just science literacy, it's a broader scope of media literacy that we really need. And to realize it's not just passive misinformation, but it is active and often well-organized disinformation that we are fighting against.
Thank you all. That was a really interesting discussion. We did have one question submitted to the Q&A, and they asked, can you comment on the efforts in your organization to establish meaningful collaborations with countries in the global South, given the historic extractivist history of scientific efforts in the past? How can science diplomacy write a new history in the global North, global South relations?
I can comment on that. And I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. One of the ways NSF sees collaboration is alluding to something one of my colleagues here said earlier, is that partnership really means working together on framing the question. And it's not like we come in as Americans, here's what we're going to do, and everybody just kind of comes along, but we work together to decide what is the question we're even asking. Is it relevant? This is not only relevant for the global South, but when we want to work in areas where Indigenous peoples have knowledge that they've had for millennia. At any rate, NSF is working very hard to build ties with our counterpart science agencies in some of those countries. In some cases, they may not have a science agency. And that's a case where actually the Embassy Science Fellows has helped. We had one of our staff who took a fellowship in Indonesia and worked with them to help them stand up a science agency. This was a number of years ago. And since then, I think it hasn't persisted, the agency that was stood up, because there was a change in the Indonesian government. It didn't really pan out the way we had hoped. But this idea of coming alongside those countries to build up their own scientific infrastructure to help their governments understand the value of this, that they need to focus on it. That's one level on which NSF is doing this. And then, of course, the other level would be working. We cannot fund scientists in those countries. It's just not what our agencies, what Congress allows us to do. But we can find partners who can fund those collaborators. So that's a much longer conversation, but I can say it's something we're thinking about very hard.
And I hope you're successful, because I think one of the challenges that we have, and we try to look, if we're going to get beyond kind of that extractiveness history, we're going to want to build the capacity of the countries themselves to solve these problems. And again, that means educating, if we can, their students and building those relationships. And even within our small institute, we have students from Brazil, Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, Indonesia, Bangladesh. I can't fund them. I can't access the same resources, the same fellowships that I can for American students. And so I think we do have to have conversations within our development assistance architecture about how we can provide better support to enable these countries to build their own scientific capacity to the degree that they can take these challenges on themselves. And I think that's an important part of the debate that needs to happen.
Yeah, I'll just add, this is a way that NSF would love to use Embassy Science Fellows in the future, is to work on this problem.
Yeah, and just I will say, historically, the Embassy Science Fellows program has been really successful at sending fellows to countries in the global South. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but one of the things that we realize is that this kind of small scale program is one in many places. Sometimes the only really kind of tool that we can use in places where there isn't a robust scientific infrastructure, or where the scientific infrastructure that exists perhaps doesn't have the same maturity level in terms of technological development and capacity, where a more symmetrical bilateral relationship can be done. But I think, to tie into what Aaron and Nancy were also saying, historically, we know that science has been co-complicit in colonialism since the very beginnings of science. To some extent, the idea of science as a specialized enterprise, and this is me putting my history hat on and taking the State Department hat off for a moment. This was part of the whole colonial project, was to do natural history collections, was to assess kind of the history of the world in that kind of robust way. Science developed as a specialized enterprise and as an exclusive enterprise, partly as a way of supplanting indigenous knowledge traditions and to establish dominion over them. And so can we actually say, here is a new version of science which is decolonized without doing a lot of hard work? And can we do that from the perch of being the United States government, and sort of decolonizing science at the same time? I'm not sure that we necessarily can do that work. I'm not sure that it's really our place to do all of that work. What it is, I think, our place to do is to listen to the people who are doing that work and to incorporate their voices and their feedback. I think that, if you look at some of the steps that the department has taken recently, that the US government has taken recently, I'd point to things like a recent executive order signed by President Biden on incorporating indigenous ecological knowledge into the decision and other policies that are going on. This is domestic as well as international. So I think that there are efforts to sort of at the role of what a national policy can look like to try to address how do we engage the knowledge traditions about nature that have been supplanted by what, for want of a better term, we would call the monolith of Western science. And so on one hand, we want to bring the fruitful parts of the scientific work that we do to collaborate with people in the global South, but we also want to be in a mode of listening and expanding out the scope of what science and science cooperation could even be.
Adam, thanks for saying that. That was well done.
Yeah, thank you all. This was a really awesome, interesting discussion, very helpful to all of us here in the room and then online too. We are at time, so I am going to stop the recording.